yes, I'm Matthew Dunstan, and I'm here with Claire, and unfortunately our other colleague Mark Basham, who also worked on the game, couldn't be here today. So this is essentially presenting our project, developing a game to showcase the work done at the Diamond Light Source and what it's like to be a scientist there. Great. So firstly, what is sort of the aim? What was the aim when we sort of started out? Was to we've essentially made a board game to try and engage students, primarily primary aged students, but also secondary aged students as well, to engage in the type of science that can be done at Diamond, and what that means to be a national facility, and the kind of different experiments that can be done there in different fields, but also to actually try and put them into a role of what it's like to be a scientist day to day, and how that interfaces with careers in science that they might be able to take on further down the track of their education. We didn't, so we all know each other through Diamond, although in different ways. Both Claire and Mark work at Diamond, and they're scientists there. I myself am a research scientist at the University of Cambridge. I'm actually have been a user of Diamond before, so I've gone there to do experiments myself. And it itself is a particle accelerator based near Oxford, near Didcot, and it's essentially uses light that's accelerated at very high speeds, that will essentially is used to do various different experiments over a very wide range of disciplines in biology, chemistry, geology, history, and conservation science. It's not necessarily a facility that is well known, and it's certainly not necessarily something that's taught very much in schools as to what can be done at these sort of facilities. And so we wanted to make a game to sort of reveal that reality to the students, and to sort of open their eyes to what's possible. And indeed what's possible in a world-leading facility in their own backyard, which is a great thing that we have here in the UK. So it didn't necessarily start exactly in this point, and normally this part of the talk would be given by Mark, because he was sort of the progenitor of the idea, and he wanted essentially a game that he could kind of play with his friends to sort of show off all the different details and zany aspects of Diamond, and even some of the aspects that we don't probably want the public to know, like how you have to sort of battle to get funding or battle to get time on the instruments, because it's very competitive for people around the world. And after a few initial chats and realizing that maybe the peer review process isn't particularly fun to play with in a board game, we decided to make it as an outreach tool for students. So something that's simple enough for students to play in a classroom setting, or in a sort of an outreach setting, whether they're coming to Diamond or elsewise. And this was actually kind of the point where I came more involved with the project. So besides being a research scientist, I'm also a game designer, and I've had a number of tabletop games, board games published. And so I sort of came in thinking about how do we think about the design of this game, and how can we sort of marry, the science and the educational aspects. So I've sort of put out this idea of this sort of game education continuum, and it's not a strict continuum. Of course, there are a lot of examples of projects which it's sort of not one or the other, but sometimes I like to think of some games or typical board games are focused more on the game. Science, if it's used as a theme, it is merely just a setting. It sometimes helps you make sense of what you're doing in the game, but the actual actions you're taking, don't necessarily have a lot of basis in realistic science, or the details are somewhat omitted. And I think of games like Pandemic, while yes, there are certainly aspects that tally up with real life, it's certainly not the point of the game. That the sort of the game mechanisms are the things that are made to be the sort of the star and the focus of that experience. And on the other end, you also have games which I'd say are probably more focused on simulation. So the educational aspect is much more to the fore, and the game mechanisms are usually very simple, or in fact not particularly important. It's much more about the content that you're delivering in that experience, and what can be learned from that. And what I'm sort of interested in is games that can sort of bridge. It's not really a divide, but where essentially mechanisms can inform the educational outcomes. So where the two actually work together and support each other, and I think a really great, there's some great examples out there. One is made by the hosts of this forum, Carbon City Zero, which is a fantastic melding of a game where actually you are really put into the role of a town mayor trying to lower the carbon levels of the city. Another game is Evolution, which is a sort of a card game where you have different adaptations for your animals which match this sort of evolution process, and really is a great mix between an engaging game, but where those mechanisms again directly feed into the understanding of how scientific concept works. So this sort of middle zone is where we were sort of trying to target. And some other sort of focuses are certainly trying to keep it simple, because this is something that not only needs to be played by a sort of very wide range of students, some of them quite young, it needs to fit into a relatively short period of time. And within that, you would like the possibility to really have players directly experience what it's like to be a scientist at Diamond. And it's a little bit different to being a scientist in some other lab setting or university setting. Being a sort of world-leading facility, often there's a lot of pressure at Diamond. You're given 1 or 2 days to do an experiment that you might have been planning months to do, and this is the only place in the world that you can carry that out. And so not only does it require a lot of dedication, but it's a lot of collaboration with a very wide range of people, technical and research scientists who are staff at the facility. And so sort of trying to encapsulate that as best we could. And also to try and do this simply in terms of the actual game that we're going to produce, because we don't want it to cost that much. We're starting, we're not experienced board game publishers, so the simpler and fewer sort of components we have, the better, essentially. So where we sort of started with in the design process was that putting the players directly in that role. They are scientists at the Diamond Light Source, and they travel around beamlines. Beamlines are different experimental stations within the facility, which perform different types of different work in different fields. And they're going to perform experiments, so that they're essentially going to make progress towards larger projects. And this experimenting is the key point, which is essentially mechanically done by drawing cards from an experiment deck, which reveals successes, which move you further towards completing a project. But it's up to you when you choose to stop doing experiment. And if you go too far, you risk essentially busting and getting failures, which will retard that progress. And this hopefully echoes somewhat of the sort of same risk reward that you have doing experiments under this sort of time pressure at Diamond. So from a game design perspective, a good adage is the idea of failing faster. And it's the idea that you're never really going to know if an idea is any good until you actually play it. Everything seems amazing in your head, but when you actually try and put it on the table and interact with it, you realize what its flaws are. So failing faster is to try and do that as quickly as possible. So I sort of knocked up a very quick version, with Adobe Illustrator. So on the left is a segment of the board. I just took a schematic map of Diamond, just essentially as a background. I divided it up into different beamlines. I just got some generic scientific symbols and sort of made up, the project cards and the experiment cards, just to get a feel of how it played. Actually, remarkably, very quickly, that central idea of how experiments could work and that push your luck aspect worked really well. It's engaging but simple, and it's fun, which is sort of that hopefully that combination of all the things you want. And that simple aspect of just moving to a beamline and doing experiment on turn is a very simple structure for people to understand, but encapsulates the different types of science and different experiences you can do. We also included very early on these ideas of staff cards to try and again highlight that science is not it's not a lone pursuit of one person. It's a collaborative pursuit, and that you'll be working with various people at the beamline. These later became events. There was a lot of some humor about us recalling various experiences at the beamlines. Often you're working. Sometimes you're working through the night. Essentially, you're working 12-hour shifts, and when you get near the end of those shifts, that definitely maybe affects the kind of quality of work you're doing. But not everything made it through that design process. We wanted to focus on collaboration even further, the idea that the players would collaborate with each other as sort of a fundamental part of the game. As I would perform an experiment, someone else could choose to another player could choose to do that experiment with me. This didn't make it through in the end. It was just a little too complicated. But actually, we did get to sort of keep that in the game in the form of some events which allow the players to work together in a sort of special circumstance. And really, I think the sort of hardest task of all was actually that event deck. It's what gives a lot of variety, and I think a lot of again, it's a nice marriage between trying to put the experiential part of Diamond into the game, so the players can really feel that experience and have a real effect on how they're doing in the game, but keeping them simple and making sure there's not too many different types, how they're worded in a sort of very concise but clear fashion, so that people don't have to keep looking at the rules. That proved to be quite tricky. And at the end of the day, we were able to essentially make a finished version. This is actually I'm slight spoiler, but this is a print and play copy of the game, which is actually available now to download. But you can see that actually from my original prototype hasn't changed too much in terms of this idea of the beamlines. The icons were sort of cleaned up, and Claire's going to talk a lot much more about the sort of the other aspects of the design of the game soon, so I won't steal that. But yeah, we got there essentially. The only other thing I just want to note very briefly is the other sort of problem with board games, I would say, in terms of outreach, or even just generally as an entertainment pursuit. I would say the biggest barrier is actually learning how to play. Most other forms of media or entertainment are somewhat self-explanatory. You watch a movie, you read a book. They don't require a technical manual to understand and digest before you can actually undertake the experience. And one of the interesting things that is starting to happen more and more is the use of video to teach rules of games, which of course is it's a different kind of experience than reading, again, essentially a technical manual. And so we partnered with Paul Grogan at Gaming Rules, who's a board game reviewer and YouTuber essentially, but he also makes a lot of instructional videos and edits rule books as well for a living. And he made an instructional video for our game, which we can essentially use as a link in the rule book, but also a way to advertise the game for people to get a sense of how it plays, without having to read the rules. So that's also something to think about. And with that, I think I've kept to my half of the time, and so I'll pass over to Claire.
Thank you very much, Matt. we're going to swap screen sharing now, which is always tricky. So I'm going to be digging a little bit into design. And I think this is something that I am really fascinated by. I've always been very enthusiastic thinking about inclusion and how we can make inclusive design. And so those are some of the principles that I was really pleased to be able to explore with this project. So there are loads of different types of principles of design, but the things that we wanted to focus on, which you might have already got an idea of, is thinking about a clean design, making it gender neutral, accessible for deaf and hard of hearing people and people with colour blindness and or low level visual impairment. Oh, and where do you even start with this? Well, the key things that I'm going to talk about today are thinking about colour, icons, imagery, size, fonts, words, accessibility generally, but also thinking about research and actually talking to people and asking them what they need in a game. And I think that's something that a lot of people miss when they think about design. And also thinking about testing and evaluating and being open to criticism. And I think we learned so much by doing so much playtesting on so many different levels. Thinking about the design itself, the first thing I wanted to talk about was color. So these are actually the scientist cards that appear in the deck. And there are various reports about color. It's written an awful lot about in literature, but attending the Royal Astronomical Society event on communicating physics and astronomy to a visually impaired audience, members of the community there, of the visually impaired community, expressed preferences for light font on dark backgrounds. And so that's the design that we integrated in. And we also consulted with members of the visually impaired community at Diamond, and worked through our designs with them. So we're really grateful to them for their time and their feedback, because I think it's definitely completely changed the design that we had originally thought about. But actually we think it's made it so much better and so much cleaner, which is a really powerful thing. And the other thing about colour is actually for colorblind people, board games can be really, really tricky to navigate if they only can distinguish a card based on color alone. So what we've done is used both color and icons to differentiate the different science areas, for example. So down here, for example, on the metallurgist, you've got a purple chemistry sign and you've also got a blue physics sign, but both the icons and the colors are different. And that gives you two different sources to cue people in, which is really helpful. Thinking about color number 3, I can't actually talk about this just now because I don't have the full graphs for this, but we actually looked and investigated box design color of all things. And that's going to be something that I think we'll be talking about in our paper that we're working on at the moment and are really excited about. So we've really explored this from quite a few different angles in terms of thinking about what would draw people to a game or maybe what would deter people from playing the game. The other thing to think about is icons. Like I said before, we made, there's lots of different approaches to this, and we chose to make our icons, our characters rather, gender neutral, so people could project their identity onto them. And like I said, there's lots of different approaches, but this was the one we felt would be the nicest for this particular game. Going now into size and font. So all of our cards are big. They're the biggest card size we could get. It maximizes the visibility of the content for the players, and also all of the font is as big as possible and very concise. We had a lot of work with this, and we worked very closely with Brett Gilbert, who Matt works really closely with as well, to try and make sure the instructions were clear but also not cumbersome for people to read, because again, thinking about our visually impaired colleagues, if there's a huge amount of text, it's actually a really big deterrent from them and gives them a lot more work to do if they want to play the game. And I think that's something that we maybe take for granted. If you are able to just quickly read a card, or to quickly see the difference in colors, we don't recognize that's an awful lot more work for our colleagues. So that's something that I think was really, really helpful for me to learn about. I am picking on a game here, but it's just one example that I could think of off the top of my head. It's actually a game I love. This is Villagers. And to just get you to think a bit more about this, if you compare the two cards, on the surgeon card here, you have two pieces of information. Essentially, you have the fact they're a surgeon, which is pretty clear, and also their science icons, which are in the bottom left, and they're both color coordinated there as well. So there's icons and colors. In the case of Bed Builder, if you know the game, there's actually 6 pieces of information on this card, but 3 of them are distinguishable only by color. So thinking about, say, our colorblind colleagues, they're not going to be able to distinguish a gold and a silver icon, and that's something that is something to consider when you're designing a game. The next thing to think about are words. Again, Brett was really super helpful here. Choose your words carefully. More is not more. And this is something that we had to kind of push back against in our feedback. A lot of people wanted us to have, really lots and lots and lots and lots of words, but actually for people who don't play board games very often, huge essays about, for example, about Diamond or about, how to play a game are actually really off-putting. So Brett was brilliant. He really helped us stream down the words that we were using and keep it really clean and focused. And that made the game a lot more playable. Large volumes of text are also a barrier to people with learning difficulties. So that was something that we wanted to build in. Another piece of feedback that we thought was really interesting, and again, hadn't considered, was talking with some teachers who work in a school for hearing impaired students. They said that actually playing the game is really helpful for these students because it supports them to learn new vocabulary, words that they maybe might come across in their day-to-day life, but actually wouldn't be able to set them in context. And so that was something that we were really, really interested by and thought was really good. I should give a disclaimer here. This is really important. We're not trying to attack or discredit anybody. We're just maybe suggesting that people could think a bit more closely about how your game design might be exclusionary. And we also know our design is not perfect. There are plenty of flaws there. but we're learning and we're trying to incorporate what we're learning into what we're doing. One of the things that I really want to give a big shout out to is Meeples Like Us. I've given their website here, but they're also on Twitter, and they do amazing work on like evaluating games and really supporting you to think about all the different categories that you could address with your game design. It's very, very difficult to hit every single category, and I think it's probably good to accept that you might not be able to, but it's really interesting to think about, well, what can I achieve maybe by a small change in my design? Maybe I can open my game to more people who might otherwise feel excluded. Thinking now about evaluation, we did quite a lot of testing, and I think that's something that made the game so much better. So originally, when we actually started with the paper copies that Matt was showing you, we did playtesting with over 50 people to iron out the mechanics and the gameplay before we went anywhere near schools. We wanted to be confident in our design and we wanted to know that it worked. And I think that was something that really was really good for us to do. It ruled out so many of the small things that like weren't functional or didn't work at all. And we then optimized that design through play tests with secondary school groups, because that was one of the main areas we wanted to target. And they again gave us incredibly valuable feedback, and with that was all integrated into the final design. Then, so we've evaluated that the design works, but then you want to evaluate, does the game actually do what you want it to do? Because this is an educational game. We're trying to get people to think about science careers, about the life of a scientist. How do we know this works? And so we then evaluated the success or the failure of the game by surveying 222 students who played the game. And the eventual success of this, well, the success of the game actually led us to apply for and receive a Sparks Award. So this is from the UK government. STFC is the awarding body to deliver the game into UK schools. We did also, like I said, get targeted feedback on inclusion. So by consulting with visually impaired and colourblind players during the early stages to make sure design is accessible, and also sending the game to be tested at the Mary Hare School for Deaf Children. And we're really grateful to all of those people for their time. So the results. Well, like I said, this is from the testing of the hard copy. We had 222 students. We asked them before and after they played, would you be a scientist or engineer? We saw a significant increase there. Our error margin in this data is 5%, so that is a significant result. However, if you think about it, it's interesting that with I Like Science, it's essentially not much of a change at all. It's not a change even given the error margin is 5%. And what we think that is that a lot of these students are already studying science, so they know they like science. We're not expecting that in a 40-minute board game, well, a 20-minute board game really, that we're going to change their world vision of science. But what we think is happening here with also the uplift in I see science in my day-to-day life is that actually students are realizing where they are maybe missing science in or not seeing science in their life, and also where maybe they haven't considered careers that could lead to them being a scientist or an engineer. And so we thought that was quite powerful as a way of kind of introducing new careers. And we've also had some feedback from careers teachers about this, and this is something they're really excited about because they struggle to kind of demonstrate the breadth of STEM careers that are available. The 82% I had fun, I know it's quite a simplistic question, but if the game isn't fun, then there's no point in playing it. So that was quite an important thing to explore. This is one of the really interesting questions that we had. So we basically gave them a word cloud.
5 minute warning, Claire.
Okay, cool. Okay, how far? Yeah, I won't go into this too quickly. Essentially, the biggest thing to note is on the left, you're looking at the before word cloud, and on the right, you're looking at the after. The after word cloud includes words like success, collaboration, and failure. Collaboration and failure are really interesting. They're not things that appear very often when people think about science, but they're things that we would like people to think more critically about in terms of science. So that was a really positive result. Matt already mentioned we have a print and play, and it was something that we'll post into the chat. That happened when COVID-19 hit, because we thought actually we can change this around. We can make this into an accessible version for people. But we also had to think a bit about evaluation, because obviously if you're going to make a game, you want to understand how people are engaging with it and who is downloading it around the world. We have a pre-survey and a post-survey. but the post survey isn't really getting a huge amount of feedback, even though we've incentivized it. So essentially we're offering 5 copies of the game to be raffled away. Raffled is probably not a word I'm allowed to use, but to be randomly allocated if you fill in the feedback survey. But not many people have done that, which is a bit frustrating, but it's something that we're trying to explore. We did have a quick redesign for the print and play, and that was just thinking about people who maybe wouldn't have a huge amount of ink or like a huge volume of printing. That, you know, asking somebody to print out 20 pages versus 10 pages is a big difference. So we had to think very carefully about how we presented our game and how to actually redesign it so it was more accessible. It does, however, reduce the contrast massively and significantly, but we offer that on request. It's not an ideal solution in terms of inclusion, but it's something that we had to kind of weigh this up and respond. Over 10,000 players in 30 plus countries around the world have played our game, which it still blows my mind. I love this so much. This is so amazing. We've had huge uptake in the UK, Ireland, America, and also Australia. Germany as well has been pretty high. At the moment, we don't have any non-English versions of the game, but it's something we could explore and would be interested in exploring. But it's been really exciting to kind of see this little thing that we've created spread around the world. Thinking then, I did say before, we wanted to know who is downloading the game. Well, it's mainly people who would already have high science capital. So they're already thinking about science maybe in their daily life, or they may be engaged very actively in science. And we thought that might be the case, given that, you know, we're distributing it via our social media networks and things like this. So we're aware this is a limitation of our distribution mechanisms and are trying to reach out to different people and different organizations to try and spread it further so we can actually reach people who don't normally see science in their day-to-day life, because that's obviously an area we'd love to engage with. One of the final things just to run through is we also asked the people who are downloading the game, what does being a scientist mean? And the high science capital people, basically the people who are scientists gave us some really interesting results. They said poor, they said being a scientist means nothing, which is quite existential, suffering, sacrifice, failing, difficulty, which is quite frightening. But a lot of people, or most people, were really, really positive. And we were really lucky. We had some Nuffield students who analysed our data for us and actually did basically sentiment analysis. So using the happiness score from the Hedonometer website, they looked at different words, like the 20 most popular words. And here, the blue words are the words that we actually that we used, or that people submitted. The green words are just examples on either end. So laughter is just an example of a really positive word. Sadness is an example of a really negative word. The dots, there's quite a lot of information on this graph, I apologize. The dots are basically how often the word appeared. So for example, curiosity was the most popular result. It appears, I think it's something like 85 times. It's not like the most positive in terms of word choice, but it's still quite positive. Fun came up less frequently, but it was still, you know, it's an extremely positive word for people to be using when they talk about science. Knowledge was one of the interesting ones, because this actually was one of the ones that was used quite a lot by people who don't talk about science as often. So I thought that was really interesting when thinking about the different words that people might associate with science. What next? Well, we're finalising the hard copies of the game to be delivered into schools in the next 6 months. It's a huge amount of work, but we're really excited. We're exploring funding options to distribute the print and play version via food banks. I know we've already had a small collaboration with STFC on this, and we're really thrilled and really excited about that. There is also some potential to explore an autism-friendly version. And also we'd really like to, we're working on writing up our results to share what works and also what doesn't work, because we've definitely learned a huge amount about that. I'd like to thank a couple of people. So lots of people from Diamond and our playtesters, Paul, Brett and Chris for design and videos and rules, the schools for playtesting, and also our students, so Catherine, Fortune and Larea for data analysis, the Nuffield for their support, Diamond and STFC for funding and supporting the project, Sam and the Manchester Games Network for the invite. Thank you very much, and Paul as well. And also finally, if you would like to talk to us, well, if you'd like to download the game, first of all, I'll include the link in the chat in a second. Please do, we'd love to hear what you have to say. And also you can, if you do download and give us feedback before the 30th of September, you could be one of the people who's in the draw for the 5 hard copies of the game. You can also talk to us, so Mark, Matt and myself, all our details are here. I just finally want to thank both Mark and Matt because we've had a wild time working together and I think we've all learned so much. And yeah, finally, I should say you should never play Diamond the game with me because I will lose. And I don't know how I've managed to design a game, be one of the co-designers in a game where I managed to 100% of the time lose. But statistically, this is what seems to happen. So maybe you can say it's more fair or I don't know, unfair. I have no idea, but it's been a huge pleasure to be able to be involved in this. And yeah, we'd be very happy to answer any questions anyone has.